While Isabel is still settling in, I should say something about her. I'd like to say something about her. Isabel Lewis is a Berlin-based artist born in the Dominican Republic and raised on a, and I quote, man-made island off the coast of southwest Florida. Before relocating to Berlin in 2009, she lived in New York City for several years, and she danced for many choreographers, showed her own commissioned works at the Kitchen, Dance Theater Workshop, New Museum, and Movement Research at Judson Church, dance-based project at St. Mark's Church, PS 122, and the, I don't know if you have to say Dia or Dia Foundation. Dia Foundation. Isabel is trained in literary criticism, dance, and philosophy. Her work takes on many different formats, from lecture performances to workshops, music sessions, parties, hosted occasions. In fact, occasion is a term that you came up with. Yes? Yeah. And a large-scale artistic programmatic works like the Institute of Embodied Creative Practices and large-scale activations of public spaces, as in her work Urban Flourishing's 2018 for Basel Messerplatz. So that was in front of, imagine, the Basel Art Fair. We all being the MFA Sandberg Institute, traveled all the way to Sharjah just last week to see Isabel in action in one of these large-scale performances. Before that, the first time I saw her, I traveled all the way to London because I read about it and I thought, what is this? I need to know more, I need to experience it. Today, in her performance lecture piece called Long Flow Dramaturgies in Heterotopic Space, Isabel will speak on her approach to dance and choreography with the agentic power of doing and not merely representing, and on composition as a public expression of care. She will discuss different presentation formats using examples from her past and present work to expand upon performance and choreography as experienced beyond the concert stage and the white cube. You ready?
No, I'm not exactly ready, but we're going to. If you want to say more, sure.
Should I read out her? Is this going to say
some couples gotchas?
Oh, we're going to use.
I mean, if you don't have anything more to say, that's fine.
Does anybody want to share something? Does everybody have a feeling about earlier today that they would like to present here? No?
I'm happy to entertain.
Oh yeah? Okay, we'll
try.
As well
as
as
set up.
I'm going to let you entertain. Thank you, Isabel.
I still need a couple of more things from my tech friends, like 2 XLR cables, one for this mic and one to connect me into the small mixer. Wow, it's really like, it's almost like emptying out the contents of your purse, your intimate things to kind of set up in front, but it's kind of transformative somehow. Hopefully we'll be getting this sound going soon so that we can start, but also one thing that maybe I can start with and just go in a little bit of a different order, which is very fitting, I would say, to the kind of non-linear ways that I try to think about composition. Well, I want to talk about a little bit about like 3 main points that I would focus on today are, I never use a mic stand, that's better. So vision, critique of vision, and maybe an advocacy for the rehabilitation of the entire human sensorium. A second point would be a critique of representation, and an advocacy for doing things and action. And the third being format, and like thinking and reflecting upon format, and how we think about which formats and how we engage with those formats, for me, is a deeply political choice. So these are all things that I'm going to touch upon as we slowly piece this together. It's funny to be setting up and at the same time. So there is a quote I want to read to you from Donna Haraway, in fact, from her book, Simian Cyborgs and Women, The Reinvention of Nature, that has to do with the eyes, specifically. The eyes, she says, have been used to signify a perverse capacity honed to perfection in the history of science, tied to militarism, capitalism, colonialism, and male supremacy, to distance the knowing subject from everybody and everything in the interests of unfettered power. The instruments of visualization in multinationalist postmodern culture have compounded these meanings of disembodiment. The visualizing technologies are without apparent limit. The eye of any ordinary primate like us can be endlessly enhanced by sonography systems, magnetic resonance imaging, artificial computer-aided tomography scanners, color enhancement techniques, satellite surveillance systems, home and office BDTs, cameras for every purpose, from filming the mucous membrane lining the gut cavity of a marine worm living in the vent gases on a fault between continental plates, to mapping a planetary hemisphere elsewhere in the solar system. Vision in this technological feast becomes unregulated gluttony. All perspectives give way to infinitely mobile vision, which no longer seems to just mythically be about the God trick of seeing everything from nowhere, but to have put the myth into ordinary practice. So this I find a very compelling quote, as like, for me, the dominance of the visual in our culture is something that I kind of try to work hard against in multiple ways, and I think why I've been always very consistently and continuously drawn to dance, to choreography, to embodied forms of being and doing. It's interesting to me to note that the eyes in the history of the West were not actually always associated with the hygienic kind of distant cleanliness that we think about it as today. Like, according to Aristotle, quote, the organ of sight not only is acted upon by its object, but acts reciprocally upon it. If a woman looks into a highly polished mirror during the menstrual period, the surface of the mirror becomes clouded with a blood-red color. The reason for this is that the organ of sight is not only acted upon by the air, but also sets up an active process. So I find this fascinating that the eyes were thought to be able to even transmit the menstrual blood of a woman. So eyes as an organ of actual transmission. And you have all the way through the Middle Ages, you have medieval people very much believed in the evil eye and the ability to transmit curses or disease, to spread disease and catch disease via the organ of sight. I find this very compelling, that it's a very contemporary thing that we tend to think of the eyes as the clean distance, the object of observation that we can observe in a clean and sort of unmediated way. So a bit more about the eye, something that for me I get very interested in is trying to actually humanize this eye, to get it dirty again, to think about sight and all of its implications, and its dirty implications and messy implications and everything in between. But first, starting maybe with the physiology of the eye. So I'd like you to close your eyes for a second. And hopefully in this moment I can also get the sound going. Briefly, hopefully in a second. So most eyes have an anterior and anterior to posterior, front to back, diameter of 24 millimeters, a volume of 6 cubic centimeters, and a mass of about 7.5 grams. And that's the weight about the weight of a 2 euro coin. The eye is not shaped like a perfect sphere. Rather, it is a fused two-piece unit composed of the anterior segment and the posterior segment. The front of the eye is made up of the cornea, the iris and the lens. The cornea is about 1/5 of the eye, and the larger back portion of the eye, composed of the vitreous, retina, choroid, and the outer white shell, called the sclera, is the remaining 5/6 of the eye. So now just roll your eyes around in their sockets for a little bit. And this fine and precise movement of the eyes is controlled by 6 muscles. They're called the lateral rectus, the medial rectus, the inferior rectus, the superior rectus, the inferior oblique, and the superior oblique. And when these muscles exert different tensions, a torque is exerted on the globe that causes it to turn in an almost pure rotation, with only about 1 millimeter of translation. Thus, the eye can be considered as undergoing rotations about a single point in the center of the eye. Now you can open your eyes, you can look at me for a second while I continue to fumble with the sound. And I invite you to look, to really look. Take a look, see what you see. You can try looking in different ways, looking at detail. You can try making maybe certain kinds of speculations about me, gathered upon what you see, my style, what I'm wearing, my shape. You can try to sense if there's you get a sense of temperature, texture, maybe in relation to my hair, skin tone. Just go ahead and look. One more thing. There's one more accelerometer cable, guys. We'll get there. We didn't get a chance to rehearse this beforehand, as you can see. It's all about live, all about the live. And so I don't necessarily think that that there's something inherently, what would be the word? There's something inherently problematic about seeing in and of itself. In my opinion, it's more how we see and the attention that we take to that form of vision. And with what kind of tone do we perceive something? Like with what are we prepared? What is our ethical status as we look? So I think this is one of the things that I think became very important to me in my work. Was I think first and foremost trying to find a way to take some kind of care of that moment of looking, of preparing the visitor to see, and potentially shaping that way of seeing. Let's see if I can, I'd like to make a song with this one vocal processor. Great, let's give this a try.
responsibility.
Thank you. So to read. If anybody's been watching RuPaul's Drag Race recently, you know about reading. When they say the library is open to read. So in American slang, are you guys familiar? Are most of you familiar with this notion of to read in that particular sense? Can somebody give me an explanation, like a good sense? I feel like you know what it means to read. Yeah, I'm looking at you because I feel like you know what it means to read. How would you describe what that means in that particular sense when they say, like, when RuPaul's like, the library's open?
Okay. It's the term coming from Paris is Burning, and it's about, like, basically drag queens kind of not judging but shading each other, I guess, in a sense, to be, like, critical in a way. Yeah, to read each other, but...
Very good, yes, like it's like throwing shade, and in some ways there is a loving aspect of it somehow within the context of that community, but it's also somehow about like sizing you up to kind of break you down a little bit. It's sort of a quick read, is sort of to kind of make a quick assessment and cast a judgment. Right, and I'm kind of interested in a potentially more generous iteration of this idea of reading. Like what would it mean to read many things, to open one's receptivity? You know, if reading was less about casting a judgment and more about opening the channel of communication between something that maybe you can't actually communicate with. I mean, to what degree can we really know that we're communicating with one another, first and foremost? But could we even extend that sense of receptivity and openness to our communication with, like, all things? And that's not to anthropomorphize the thing. It's to acknowledge that the thing has an agency of its own, that is opaque to me, that I may not ever know it, but there might be this potential in what it means to try to become receptive enough to read. So in the spirit of reading, I want to share with you this one particular dance from one of my occasions, what I now call the classic occasion, the first in a series of occasions. Let's see if I have sound here. But it has to do with reading in a different way. Let's have a look. take that bitch to college, 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 college. I'ma give that bitch some knowledge, some knowledge, some knowledge, some knowledge, some knowledge, some knowledge. That bitch, that bitch, that bitch, that bitch, that bitch, that bitch. Read that bitch, read that bitch, read that bitch, read that bitch. Woo! Okay, so reading, speaking of reading, I will read for you now a story. This is actually really fun and odd, like it's quite different to anything I feel like I've done actually, but it is really in tune, I would say, with like this idea of, for me, thinking about composition as a heterotopia, as a space of difference where multiple things can happen and unfold simultaneously, where different kinds of time is never a unified experience. There's someone called Heleen Mineur, an American academic, who has this great book about, it's a long title, something about amateur readers, medieval texts, and the queerness of time, and talking about the fact of time being this kind of slippery element which fails to really ever fulfill this promise of a unified or unitized time. So I thought, in the spirit of this program, that I would try to kind of write a story, knowing that a story, a narrative, is a kind of powerful form, a powerful format that tends to kind of create a chronology, which of sorts, which I wouldn't say is like totally true to real experience, but nonetheless gives a shape, a useful format. So I'm going to catch my breath a bit, take a sip of water. Maybe I'll have some background music for it too. Let's try this. story told from the understanding that any act of telling others about oneself is at once the making of oneself in relation to others. And this relation has a narrative quality, and this narrative is inevitably always incomplete, whilst aiming at authenticity, and that any claim to authenticity is always a kind of performance. There was once a child born to a large family in the Dominican Republic, to a Dominican mother and a Jewish American father. The child was second in birth order and naturally followed everything her older sister did and became a ballerina. She was a serious child and at a quite early age had a complete aversion to the color pink and wore black ballet slippers that her parents bought her in a size too big so that she would have room to grow into them. She was a naturally gifted mover with a musicality inherited from her Afro-Caribbean ancestry. Her ears accustomed to the polyrhythms and syncopation of merengue típico had no trouble coordinating classical music with her body. An Afro-Caribbean body, a body at odds with the particular and peculiar notions of the body of 17th century France. Here begins her observation and embodied understanding of the complex process by which cultures create bodies. Any naively held notions of dance as liberatory, transcendent, and natural were completely decimated. But in their place, a newfound intellectual passion for tracing cultural histories through the body by learning ever more approaches to dance. She starts asking, what are the value systems inherent in these steps, these positions, and these movements? What kind of body does this form of dance imagine or produce? How do the processes of the mind affect the processes of the body, and how do the processes of the body affect the processes of the mind? She learned firsthand through years of study in classical ballet that it was indeed possible to operate upon her body with ideas, to control her body and shape it, much like a topiary. The teenage ballerina took her coded body to the club, the Vibe, the hip-hop club in Sarasota, Florida, that sat exactly on the border of the African-American neighborhood of this highly segregated town. It was the mid-90s, and she would alternate the weekends between weed and hip-hop, and ecstasy and raves, and abandoned warehouses. The nights spent in these spaces would spark her lifelong fascination with alternative modes of sociability and multiply existing codes of behavior, as well as the fluidity and performativity of identity construction through stylizing dress, speech, and movements. We jump a few years ahead, where the dancing teenager finds herself now at university, a women's college in rural Virginia, in the middle of cow pastures and rolling hills. She decided to study literary theory, which would allow her to spend as much time as she wanted in the library. The young student learned about words and what words do. Then she learned how to do things with words thanks to J.L. Austin. She applied Austin's notion of performative utterances, along with Judith Butler's extrapolations into queer theory, to her approach to choreography. She wanted to do things with dance, not merely represent things. She began studying the 1960s experiments of the Judson Dance Theater, and as a young adult, all that all-inclusive democracy had her drunk on freedom, a liberatory politics for dance technique, a breaking loose from the strictures of old ballet. But the feeling was short-lived, and in the haze of hangover, the student could ascertain that the loose, pedestrian, and universal body that jostled around freely in sweatpants and trainers was not at all universal. It was specifically white and specifically Western and specifically able. Was neutrality not a kind of invisibility cloak? The specter of a removed, self-confident, world-dominating, objectifying subject that could, by dint of its privileged position in the world, declare itself as neutral and its actions and movements pure and free. Because of learning the dances of the Judson era, she could feel into the codedness of this particular subject position. She could see how she herself embodied it in all aspects of her life, and she could see in the construction of the world around her, and she wanted out. She found escape in science fiction's imaginings of other worlds. First there was Philip K. Dick and Neil Stephenson, and then Octavia Butler, and feminist sci-fi brought her back to Earth, to this world, and feminist critique and reimagining of it. She became more interested in Yvonne Rainer's films than in her dances. Feminist film theory, the art of William Pope L., Karen Finley, and David Hammond spoke to her, and she spent the final year of university embodying drag, becoming an award-winning drag king as Justin Timberlake. As the colonizer and colonized, the young woman understood there was no escaping the masculine Western worldview that she had inherited. So she wanted to more deeply understand it, to find maybe compassion for it, and see if she could find a space for transformation from within it. She graduated with degrees in literary criticism and choreography, but the most important thing she got during those years of study was the practice of moving between the library and the dance studio, this intertwining of the bodily and the intellectual. She identified with the writings of Edouard Glissant. Creolization was her origin, and hybridity as a strategy of art making seemed second nature to her. She continued working with dance as it seemed to be, to her, an example par excellence of Foucault's technology of the self, a way to be concerned with the self, to care for oneself, and to ultimately maybe know oneself. So she danced for many choreographers and made her own dances for the stage, a duet for a solo dancer and a lighting designer, each one pursuing independent scores in a roulette game of vision and visibility. This was her first choreography. The wariness of the stage's promise to deliver the image for capture by the audience was clear early on. Then there was a lip-syncing routine to a mysterious and dark Ethiopian psych rock song while draped head to toe in a shiny silver reflective fabric, like mercury dripping over her body, inviting the objectification and exotification of her own form while reflecting the audience back to itself, and more and more and more stage works. All the while she struggled with the format of the theater, she was uneasy with the way it favored the eyes, and she questioned if dance could operate beyond the merely representational. The question of format and whether dance could be experienced in new ways became ever more urgent for her. There was this intuition she had about the importance of embodied experience in a detraditionalized modern society, where the scientific worldview dominated. But she found little in the field of dance that communicated with larger cultural discourses. She started attending new music events and spending time at the Stone experiencing the dynamic compositions of John Zorn and company. She went to noise concerts, metal shows, observing the different forms of bodily engagement in these different scenarios. And she started attending exhibitions more frequently too. There she similarly read the codes of behavior for the bodies in exhibitions, and read the format of exhibition itself, its liberalized organization and visitorship over the course of several hours, the way the architecture suggested a progression through a series of spaces, the way that for the most part the artworks on display seemed to pronounce their autonomy, their completeness, and a rather cold sense of detachment pervaded the entire scene. Foucault led her to the sociological concept of habitus as a system of embodied dispositions, tendencies that organize the ways in which individuals perceive the social world around them and react to it. This became for her the starting point of all dances and all artistic gestures. Back when she had, as a student, destroyed the concept of neutrality for herself, she had also mourned its loss. She had wished, as a young black female artist, that she could access that 0 point, that blank canvas, that fiction of original nothingness from which to create anew, free from the confines of identity politics that seemed to follow the reception of her work. Further understanding habitus through the sociology of Bordeaux and Mauss helped me let go of that delusional fantasy once and for all. I could see that every human act and human work originates from a body and mind shaped by its specific mix of group culture and personal history. And while I continued to study other thinkers that shaped the way we see the early and late 20th century, like Weber, Marx, Deleuze, I did so with a different feeling, with a clearer understanding of the subject position from which their works were written, and the limits of this particular modality of meaning production. I challenged myself to put intellectual concepts into physical practice for myself. In the dance studio, I experimented with concepts I found useful for composing differently in time, rather than sequentially on a timeline. I, for example, wanted to make a heterotopic dance, and so I redistributed agency amongst the agents typically involved in a dance, in the production of a dance performance, including the audience, and devised a game structure that would allow all participants to enact their individual agency while simultaneously and collaboratively creating a new dance work. That work is called Communal Experience in Performing Instantly Created Fiction. Creating this work exploded my own understanding of what could be a work of dance. The stage felt completely alien and strange to me after this. It seemed to be a perfect example of the modality of distance, observation, and judgment that I had begun to become increasingly skeptical of. With the help of Donna Haraway, I began to see that the facts that construct our Western world are kinds of stories that we tell ourselves, and our institutions are kinds of rituals we enact. I felt strongly that experimenting with existing formats and working towards the development of new formats could have a radical potential of producing new stories and new rituals that could shape a new world with a reorientation of systems of value. It's around this time that I relocated to Berlin. At this time, I was also had been commissioned to make a performance for PS 122, and I urgently needed something to move me out of my paralysis and total estrangement from the format of theater. I needed to change the way I thought of myself as a performer. The best way I could articulate the particular agency I was looking for was in the figure of the host. A host is a clear constructor of the situation of hosting guests, and guests are individuals invited into this situation. The host is responsible and accountable for what happens on a particular occasion. The host sets the table, or the stage, as it were, for an experience with others. Hosting is not only the name for actions that unfold in the concentrated focus of the guest, but as well for the peripheral activities and preparations that color the experience in a particular way. What is the vibe of a situation? What is the smell? What is the feeling in the air? Hosting for me is a particular way of holding space for the unfolding of particular kinds of experiences. I learned from gardens. Gardens helped me to conceptually frame all the things I considered composition, not just the choreography of the performers, but the unfolding of the perception of the visitor that could be guided by the shaping of attention in the same way that gardens shape the experience of a visitor through intentional compositional choices. Gardens are exactly a form of composition that do not suppress its own contingency and vulnerability. While formally resilient, they are non-autonomous. The experience of a garden is entirely vulnerable to changes in weather, to sudden shift of light when a cloud passes over the sun, to the seasons. In starting to compose for all of the senses through the use of dance, speaking, scent, sound, food, and all that I felt could sculpt the receptivity to choreography, to sight, to architectural detail, to one's own bodily presence. I named these new works hosted occasions, as I saw them as an occasion of experience, a unit of reality in the Whiteheadian sense. What drives this urge to create these kinds of situations is not just the pleasantries of a good vibe, but the challenge of creating compositions in a porous and ever-evolving situation. I'm interested in compositions that work to recast social codes of spectatorship without telling the public what to do or how to be, thus limiting their agency. In the way the garden does not prescribe a single mode of bodily engagement, but is rather hospitable to a variety of ways of engaging with it and in it. The occasions indeed are heterotopic, with various modalities of time, attention, and presence coexisting. And that's the end of the story for now. I would like to open the floor to questions, if there are any. This is like, it's been a long day for you guys, huh? Any questions? Is there someone in the back? Was that just a stretch? That was like a stretch. Okay. Cool. Maxine, do you have a question?
I was wondering a bit about the content, because it seems that your work is rarely or never presented in black box context. Then it's like the way you were talking about like these hosted occasions, and it kind of like popped in my mind the work of Martin Skomberg. That is like, now sort of wondering how you make that, like, I mean, of course it's very different, but because he works a lot in theaters and like, yeah.
Yeah, Martin's definitely a colleague of mine. We've known each other for 15 years and have been watching each other's work for that long as well. And he's somebody that I definitely relate to, because he definitely stretches out in time. Like if I were gonna, I would definitely call what he's doing a long flow dramaturgy in heterotopic space, because you kind of have usually, well, different kinds of works, but several of his works are very long in duration, and include also a lot of repetition and a lot of slow movement. And there's a kind of invitation to sort of drop out of attention. There's a kind of invitation there to kind of be on your phone or do your emails. It's like it's kind of present inside of the work, this invitation to be out of focus and to relax. And he also sets up the space with like cushions and pillows and stuff like that. So yes, I think it's true that he he kind of stayed. I mean, he's also sometimes presenting in the contemporary art context. I think for me, it wasn't so much a choice to shift into, I mean, I definitely had my issues with the format of theater. I think for the 10 years that I was making works in theater, all the works I was making were about my problems with the format. And it took me 10 years doing that before I could think of like just actually maybe making something in my apartment, or making something in the bar where I was working, or making something outside. And that way of kind of creating something on its own, that had its own terms, its own ontological terms, that were somehow in between, somehow the format of theater, perhaps an exhibition. And this is why I kind of had to find a name for these things, and I called them occasions. And I guess the predominant feature, I guess, that's consistent between the different occasions is that they are adaptable to different spaces, so they don't really belong to a format, but they can happen in a museum, they can happen in a theater. It's rare, because normally I have to kind of operate upon the space, and usually in theaters it's a bit more complicated to do, to operate on the space in a way that shifts it out of its typical use and typical function. So yeah, these invitations started coming from the contemporary art field, but I felt that also what I make is not really a response to White Cube or to gallery or to this idea. It was rather, how could I affect the conditions of whatever space I was operating in order to kind of frame in this soft way what I called the occasions. So, I mean, I do think that there's precedent for that. I think that, you know, because of the work of people like Tina Segal or Xavier Leroy, especially Tino's work, there's a fight that he fought with live performance and bodies in the museum space that I got to kind of step on top of and move beyond from, basically. So I'm not really, I don't see myself in a discourse so much with the museological, per se, but rather actually trying to carve out a space of alternative sociability. And these forms of sociability can happen in different sites. Long answer. Tangential. Thanks for your question. Any other questions, thoughts?
I met you actually last year at Art Basel the first time. I was really wowed by your performance you did with all of us. I was a part of it, and I was wondering when you talked about theory and then your practice, maybe like the chicken-egg question. What comes for you first, or how do you do your work?
Interesting. I mean, I think I actually tend to operate a lot from theory first, actually, strangely. Like, I think I'm very connected to reading and language. It's like what I was very drawn to. Of course, I guess, if I think of this early history, it was this like dancing first, but then I started thinking about dancing, and then I wanted to kind of pursue a particular kind of intellectual pathway. And I would say that it's a critique I have of myself, absolutely. That I think that, like, also inside of my work, there's that. It's like a kind of pushing myself to remember to be embodied and remember to intuit and remember to feel and not only critically think and analyze things. So it's true that I think a lot of times I start from texts, but it's something that I actually am trying to shift from. I would say like this recent work that Maxine just saw that's here, and this is like a small moment of it, was called Untitled: Juice, Inwardness, Natures. And for example, there is a work which is much more, I would say, in how I composed it, much more in this space of the poetic than in this kind of critical and theoretical. So it's a kind of area that I'm opening up for myself, I think, right now, my work. Thanks.
Thanks. I was hoping to ask you about your relationship to studio practice and
collaboration?
Yes, great question. So I very recently again have a studio for the first time in literally a decade. So I think there was a time where, I guess in this time where I was producing things inside of the theater, it was also part of the normal construction of that world that you would maybe get a commission from a theater, and then you would maybe work for 6 months in the studio, then you would present it on a stage. So I was very much in that habit of a studio practice where I would meet and gather with dancers and collaborators. Then as this work started to take like a shift, like I talk about this kind of crisis of estrangement from the theater, I like abandoned that completely. I thought I actually don't need to have a studio practice. I need to just like live life, and I need to go to parties and work my multiple jobs and think and read. And so I kind of intentionally abandoned something about a studio practice. And then just last year, so yeah, literally the first time in 10 years, I have a studio again, and I'm there. It feels very luxurious to me. I'm like, wow, this is great. I can't believe I didn't do this for so long. To have a space of one's own, to be able to meet collaborators. Collaboration is a big part, I think, of what I do, and definitely I think it's very inherent inside of the culture of dance. Like, being that I come from a culture of dance, I always will refer back to these habits of being and doing. And in dance, it's very much also that I worked as a dancer for many choreographers as well. There's something very much in the culture of dance which kind of makes one used to giving one's body over and like energies over for the kind of vision, the creation of the vision of the author, of the director, of the choreographer. I think it's like that's a very beautiful practice that I'm happy that I had a lot of experience with, because I feel like there's so much drama these days around like authorship, and I feel like dancers kind of really understand collaboration because it's something that very early on you're always doing to learn dance. It's always a very social practice. So that remains the case in what I do. In this work, for example, I have these big paintings that used to be flowing. These are by Matthew Lutz-Knoy. We developed, and you see them also flowing in the room through the windows, in these color panels. So we developed this idea together of paintings that could serve as shade structure and that could also filter light. And this was Matthew's performance in a way. It was these waving of these, the way that we figured out how to install these elements, but he did not physically himself perform. Although he did serve, there was like a cardamom and saffron coffee, this Arabic coffee, which is really from the Emirates and common in the Emirates, that we served this in the beginning of the show in these ceramic cups that Matthew made. So he was serving this coffee at the very beginning of this. It was like about a 45-minute long work. And then there was a massive, what you don't hear in this video is that there's a massive electronic sound and also live sound. So I worked with Colin Hacklander and Faranaz Hatam, who are a noise duo in Berlin called Hacklander Hatam. And Farah programs a sound, and Colin works a lot with percussion, and also we work together on this kind of choreography of the unfolding of sound over the entire site. So in all of these positions, from the big factory to this other smaller building, and even beyond the building further back, there were also musicians. There were 9 local musicians that also contributed their energies and talents to this work. So I would say that it's a big part of what I do, whether it's with musicians, architects. In the case of Matthew, it's the first time I collaborated with another. Like, normally my collaborations are either with musicians or dancers, and architects. That was like common. And then to include painting as like a form of set design. This was something kind of new for me and really exciting, because I hadn't really worked with that since this idea of set design even at all, not since my days of working in the theater.
but I'm looking at the clock and I already got a tap on my shoulder.
Yeah,
So thank you, Isabel.
my pleasure. Thank you.